Hey guys, today we are going to be reading chapters 19 through 22 in Serafina and the Splintered Heart, and we are reading this with permission of the author. Chapter 19. The Sorcerer by the river, Serafina thought. I can't see you, but I know you're there, the Sorcerer had said. He'd actually spoken to her. But it had frightened her, and she ran away like a startled deer. If I had only known, Serafina thought. When she tried to remember the details of that first strange night, she could still feel the fear in her heart. The sorcerer had been walking slowly through the forest by himself in the dead of night, working close to the ground. He had possessed some sort of dark power. Serafina didn't want to return to where she had seen him by the river. The thought of it put a twisting knot in the pit of her stomach. But the truth was, she had run out of other paths to take. Her pa had told her once that true courage wasn't just because you didn't feel fear. True courage was when you were scared of something, but you did it anyway because it needed to be done. If she was going to get back to the land of the living, she had to stay bold. She started walking in the direction of the river. As the sun rose toward noon, she thought she still had one more ridge and valley to go. But she heard the sound of rushing water ahead of her and soon came to a deeply flooded area. She realized this was the new shore of the river. The river in the forest had swollen far past where it had been before, flooding the trees for as far as she could see, the roots and trunks drowning in moving water. The flooding was so deep and wide that she couldn't even make out the main course of the river, let alone the other side of it. The dark brown current rushed by, tearing at the vegetation and carrying it along, swirling in large, twisting whirlpools and crashing up into whitewater torrents where the water passed through the upper branches of the trees. Her mind was slow to comprehend the unimaginable. The river had filled the valley. The water was tearing away everything in its path, trees and rocks, and now mountains, everything getting swept away. As she walked along the flooded bank, she realized that the place where she had seen the sorcerer a few nights before was long gone. She could feel the muddy earth she was standing on slipping away beneath her feet, the inexorable pull into the all-consuming current. The thought of it would have frightened her even in the best of times, but in her current state, she was terrified by the thought of getting sucked into a mudslide. She turned tail and headed for high ground. In the afternoon, she curled up beneath the overhang of a rock to rest. A few hours later, she started awake with a sudden jerk, but when she woke up, she couldn't move her arms or legs. She couldn't raise her body from the ground. She tried to pull air into her lungs, but she felt the solidness of the earth against her, all around her, holding her in and pressing her down. Clenching her teeth, she clawed and snarled, twisted and bent, cracking the brittle stone around her. Not yet, she told the earth as she climbed out and brushed herself off. It's getting worse, she thought, stumbling away from the crevice of stone that had nearly caught her. I've got to keep moving. As she continued her search for the sorcerer and the sun began to set, she came to a steep slope and followed it down into a wet area of bulrushes and cattails. She found her way into a mountain bog where the ground was nothing but thick layers of spongy sphagnum, moss, and peat, the ancient fiber of 100 forests that had come before. The bog exuded the dense, vaporous aroma of year upon year of amassed plants in thick black soil. The moss felt damp and strangely buoyant beneath her bare feet as she walked. Cinnamon fern and swamp laurel with dark pink flowers grew out of the wet, mushy trunks of long fallen trees. Tiny red cranberries grew all over the leafy ground, and delicate purple and violet dragon-mouth orchids hung spiraling down. As she delved deeper into the bog, she stayed alert for any signs of the sorcerer. In the puddles on the ground, yellow-spotted salamanders scurried this way and that, and small bog turtles with orange necks crawled around. Southern irises, trout lilies, and arrowhead plants were growing everywhere, along with pitchers, sundews, and other carnivorous plants. Just ahead, she heard a faint, buzzy beat. Curious, she moved towards the sound and came to a small meadow in the bog. The sun had set behind the trees just a few minutes before, and a soft, dusty orange light filled the western sky. Beat! She finally saw it. A small, pudgy, well-camouflaged brownish bird with an extremely long bill sat on the ground. It was a timber doodle. Hunters who came to visit the estate called the birds woodcocks. Mountain folk called them bog suckers or brush snipes. She thought it was interesting how different people had different names for the same thing. Mountain lion, puma, panther, painter, cougar, catamount. There were many names for her kin. Wesa had taught her that the Cherokee word was tustasy. She wondered what kind of name people had for what she had become. A haint, a haunt, a shade, a phantom, a spirit, a specter, an ethereal being. Suddenly the shy little timberdoodle burst up into the air in a crazy spiraling flight, its wings whistling and all a-twitter, flying great sweeping circles up into the twilight sky. When it reached the very top of its spiral, the woodcock hovered for a moment as if held in the air, then sang out a liquid song. From there it began to fall, tumbling back down toward the earth, folding and fluttering like it had been shot with a gun, but all the while singing through its vainglorious display. Serafina smiled. She'd never seen the sky dance of a timberdoodle before, but her pa had told her the stories. In this place, in this moment, for just a few minutes during sunset, this normally shy, lonely little bird called out to the world, "I'm here! I'm here!" He's just looking for a friend, she thought. I wonder if something like that would work for me. The thought of standing out in the middle of a meadow and leaping in great circles, tilting and twittering and yelling, I'm here, brought a cheer to her heart. Finally, the timberdoodle landed exactly where he'd started. It was then that Serafina lifted her eyes and saw the silhouette of a person standing and watching from the other side of the meadow. It was the dark-robed sorcerer she'd seen by the river. Serafina ducked down to conceal herself, not sure if the sorcerer could see her. When the hooded man finally turned and walked away, Serafina stayed low, gave him a few minutes to put some distance between them, then skirted the meadow and followed him. Serafina moved as quietly as she could through the wet forest bog, but she was determined not to let the sorcerer slip away. Then the sorcerer stopped and stood very still. Serafina hunkered down and hid behind the trunk of a large tree. The sorcerer turned his head and looked in the direction she was hiding. She thought that after a moment the sorcerer would turn back around and resume walking towards his destination, but he did not. He lifted his head, then raised his thin, delicate hands and gently pulled his hood down until the dark cloth gathered around his shoulders. That was when Serafina saw the sorcerer's face for the first time. It was not a man, but a girl. About 14 years old, she had a pale complexion, dark red lips, and long red hair. The girl's green eyes scanned the forest, looking right where Serafina was hiding. Serafina crouched down even farther, but she couldn't help peeking through the vegetation back at the girl. Her expression was filled with a grave and somber stillness, as if she had suffered a great loss. She had about her the feeling of someone who was hiding, diminished, but stoically unwilling to relinquish life, like a broken owl who no longer has the heart to fly. The girl was nearly unrecognizable in manner and form, but Serafina knew exactly who it was. Chapter 20. Fear shot through Serafina. She hunched down low and peered through the bushes. It was Rowena. Too close now to flee, Serafina wanted to pounce fast and fight her old enemy. A growling, seething anger rose up inside her for all the terrible things Rowena had done. But the more she watched the wretched girl, the more curious Serafina became. Rowena had changed. The angles of her face, the movement of her body, and especially her spirit and mannerisms were all different. Her hair was still red, but it wasn't dressed up into fancy curls like before. It was long and thick around her neck and shoulders. Her face was still pale, but she wasn't wearing any lady's makeup to brighten her lips or shadow her eyes. And she wasn't wearing a stylish dress like she always had. She wore simple, dark robes like a hermit who had withdrawn from the world. She did not appear to have a horse or carriage anymore. She walked through the forest alone. Rowena peered in Serafina's direction for several long seconds, studying the bushes where she was hiding as if she knew she was there. Serafina remained very still, unsure what Rowena could and couldn't sense. Finally, Rowena pulled the hood back up around her head and continued walking through the misty lowlands of the bog. Serafina released a long, steady breath, relieved that she'd avoided Rowena's detection. There was a part of Serafina that wanted to turn around and go home, go the other way, let wounded owls lie. But there was another part of her, the bolder, fiercer, more determined part that was saying, "Don't let her get away." Serafina decided to follow her. Pretty sure that she was invisible to even Rowena, Serafina tracked through the bog behind her, but kept a safe distance just in case. Sometimes she lost the girl in the gray mountain mist, but then she would catch up again. Soon they came to a faint path that wound even deeper into the wetlands through a dark and shadowed grove of old, ragged cedar trees with leafy ferns all around and moss-covered trunks. Finally, Serafina watched as Rowena came to a small habitation. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a large clump of tree branches. Thin, twisty twigs had grown downward from the larger limbs of the tree, and the spidery roots had grown upward, creating tight, interwoven walls of sticks with a stick-woven roof overhead. The embers of a small cook fire glowed in front of the shelter's entryway. Various collections of plants lay here and there on logs, as if drying in what little sun might filter down through the trees during the day. Serafina watched as Rowena tended to a row of carnivorous plants growing near her lair, mumbling strange and unrecognizable words as she pinched small, struggling flies and hornets in her fingers and dropped them into the awaiting mouths of the plants. A few inches from where Serafina was crouched, and in various other areas of the forest around the shelter, hazes of white spiderwebs stretched between the trees. Feeling a crawling sensation on her spine, she looked more closely into the mass of webs and saw thousands of black spiders with crooked legs and red hourglasses on their backs. Sucking in a gasp, she quickly moved away and found a new tree to hide behind. Her pa had taught her that the black widows were the most dangerous spiders around, but she'd never seen them bunched together in large nests like this before. She watched as Rowena worked. Pitcher plants, butterworts, and other carnivorous plants grew all around the shelter, up the walls and the rooftops. Rowena took several small plants out of her satchel, positioned them nearby, and moved her hand over them, mumbling something. Serafina didn't understand. When Rowena lifted her hand, the plants had taken root in their new position. When Rowena was done planting what she had gathered, she went over to the small stream that ran nearby, its water tinted light brown with the tannin of the swamps, where she slowly washed her hands. Serafina couldn't help but notice that it was the only small, gentle stream she'd seen in a long time. She wondered if the storm creature did not know about this hidden place. Serafina crept deeper into Rowena's lair, more and more curious about what she was seeing. Several chickens and gray-spotted fowl roamed nearby, along with a tribe of goats with long, shaggy black hair, thick, curving horns, and strange, square pupils in their eyes. Serafina peered into the shelter of woven sticks. Other than the simple bed and a place for food, it seemed to be filled with glass flasks and orbs containing green, yellow, and milky white liquid. As she watched Rowena slowly and calmly gather leaves from some of the plants outside the shelter, Serafina frowned. Rowena had been deceitful and dangerous, but she had been alert and full of life. Now she seemed so grave in spirit. It was as if a great loneliness had grown within her, and now had nearly overtaken her. Like a thick carpet of moss overtaking a tree that had fallen onto the forest floor. "I can feel you watching me," Rowena said. Serafina froze right where she was, her heart pounding. "I told you to leave me alone," Rowena said harshly. "I'm through with you." Serafina moved back a little and crouched down in the bushes. Rowena pulled back her hood and shouted angrily out into the woods in the other direction. "Just get out of here! I don't want you here!" It seemed that Rowena couldn't see her after all. But who was she talking to? Curious to see what would happen, Serafina stepped a little closer. "No, I told you to go away," Rowena said, as if she knew exactly what she was doing. "I can hear you breathing down my neck. I'm not going to do your bidding anymore. I'm through with you, so stop bothering me." As Rowena stood up in anger, the air around her compressed and expanded violently, buffeting Serafina back. Frightened, Serafina quickly retreated into the forest. Serafina knew she should turn and slink away from Rowena's wet, boggy lair. It was obvious that her old enemy had become far more powerful, but in other ways the girl seemed so diminished. Serafina thought about abandoning this idea of approaching Rowena and just skulking back to Biltmore and trying to make the best of her situation, but she hated the thought of it. She couldn't talk to them, she couldn't warn them, she couldn't help them in any way. In the nights to come, when the storms finally hit Biltmore and the river burst, what was she going to do? And what about Braden? Had he started sucking up the souls of lost children like the man in the black cloak, greedy for more power and more life, his skin slowly rotting from his body? Was he the root of all this evil or a victim of it? And no matter what he was, could she abandon him? When she thought about Oasis, she remembered him looking straight through her like she didn't exist anymore. The world was wrecked. It broke her heart to think about enduring another night of this. She pulled in a breath, plucked up her courage, and spoke. "I haven't been bothering you," she whispered. "I just got here." Rowena immediately froze, obviously surprised by the sound of her voice. For several seconds, Rowena did not move or say a word. Her dark red eyebrows furrowed. "Who are you?" she asked. Chapter 21. Serafina couldn't believe it. Rowena had heard her. She was actually talking to her. "I'm warning you," Rowena said sternly, looking up into the air. "I'll summon you out by force if I have to." As Rowena lifted her open hand, the trees above Serafina began to shake and rattle with a threatening violence. Serafina could feel the air around her pulsating. "I know you're there," Rowena said, "so don't just lurk out there. Tell me who you are." Serafina was too frightened to answer. Fearing that Rowena would destroy her the moment she said her name, she wanted to run while she still had the chance. But Rowena was the only person she'd encountered since she'd crawled out from the grave who could hear her. "Are you living, or are you dead?" Rowena demanded. Serafina froze. She didn't know what to do. "I asked you a question," Rowena said. "Are you living, or are you dead?" Finally, feeling like she had no other choice, Serafina decided to speak again. I don't rightly know," she admitted. Rowena seemed to understand that answer in ways that Serafina did not. "But who are you?" Rowena asked again. "Where do you come from?" Her voice was gentler now, almost kind, as if she'd enticed reluctant spirits from the shadows before. Serafina began, but then stopped, too uncertain to continue. "Don't be frightened," Rowena said, her voice filled with a compassion that Serafina had never heard from her before. "Just tell me your name. No harm can come from that." Serafina stopped again. "Yes?" Serafina ducked down behind a tree. "I'm Serafina," she said finally. "The cat?" Rowena hissed, her face blanching as she spun around and peered out into the forest. She crouched down and looked all around her like she thought a catamount was going to pounce on her at any moment. And Serafina knew that she probably would have attacked the sorceress if everything had been the way it was before. But in her current form, how could she fight Rowena? How could she do anything? "Something's happened to me," Serafina told her. "But you're still here in this world," Rowena said, her voice filled with uneasiness as she looked warily around her for signs of attack. "Part of me, at least," Serafina said. Rowena paused, taking in these words. "But why have you come here?" she asked suspiciously. "You're the only person I've found who can hear me," Serafina said. Rowena pressed her lips together and nodded. "I can speak to both sides now." "You mean the living and the dead? Were you the one who woke me from the grave? Were you talking to me?" Rowena ignored her question. "Was it you?" Serafina pressed. "What did you say to me?" Rowena shook her head. "It doesn't matter now. Just the ramblings of a troubled soul, nothing of consequence. I have to be careful when I go to a cemetery, but especially that one." Then Rowena's tone took a harder edge, like she wanted to change the subject. "Did you come here to my home to kill me? Is that it? To seek your revenge?" Serafina knew it was a fair question, but as she had been talking to Rowena, she felt more and more relieved that she was finally able to interact with someone. Whether she wanted it to or not, her hatred for Rowena was slowly fading behind her into a past that seemed so long ago. "No," she said to Rowena, "I didn't follow you here to kill you. To be honest, after the battle for the Twisted Staff, I thought you and your father were already dead." "We're not easy to kill," Rowena said. "But I don't understand what's happening. Is Braden on your side now?" "No," Rowena said. "But I saw him with the black cloak." "Where did you see him?" Rowena asked quickly, her voice filled with so much interest that it made Serafina reluctant to answer. "I don't understand," Serafina said. Where did the black cloak come from? I destroyed it on the angel's sword the night we defeated Mr. Thorn. We remade it, Rowena said. The silver clasp is the core of its power, not the fabric. Serafina frowned in aggravation, regretting she hadn't found the clasp, and melted it down when she'd had the chance. Rowena seemed to have so much more knowledge than she did, so much more capability, and yet there was something about her, a hopelessness in her, a feeling of resignation, of giving up. And there had been fear in her, too. She'd been frightened of something, telling it to go away. Who or what was she hiding from deep in this forest bog? The truth is, Serafina said finally, I have no wish to harm you, Rowena. With the way I am now, I'm just glad to know that I am not just a gust of wind. A lot has happened since I fought against you, Rowena said, her voice somber and weary. It was clear to Serafina that she, too, had suffered. What do you mean? Serafina asked, moving towards her. You've corrupted Braden, haven't you? You've pulled him to your side. No, Rowena said again, her voice edged with fierceness. I haven't. But he's not who he was before, Serafina said. None of us are, Rowena said. He no longer cares about his animals. He's lying to his aunt and uncle, and I told you I saw him wearing the black cloak. You've taken him. Suddenly, Rowena turned, looking around her towards an accuser she couldn't see. You think you know him? She snarled. You think you can see what's inside his heart, whether he's good or bad, strong or weak? You don't know anything about any of us, Cat. You're such a little fool. But I don't understand, Serafina screamed at her in reply. You think you've lost your friend? Is that it? Rowena scoffed. You don't even know what friendship is. And you do? Serafina snarled. I've seen it, Rowena hissed. What are you talking about? Serafina cried in confusion. Sometimes you're blind, Cat, with more teeth and claws than sense, Rowena shouted, as she grabbed a flask from her cache. I will show you what I've seen. Rowena hurled the glass flask towards the sound of Serafina's voice. It crashed against the trunk of a tree and exploded with a great blast of whirling smoke and a bright, blinding haze. Then Rowena threw another flask, and it shattered against the ground, its dark and blue contents rising up in a great swirl. Then she threw another, and the whole world felt as if it were shifting beneath Serafina's feet. Serafina felt cold air all around her, and then the world disappeared. Chapter 22. Suddenly, Serafina found herself standing inside Biltmore, the air strangely cold. The French doors to the loggia were open, the sheer white curtains glowing with the light of the full moon and fluttering in the cold winter breeze. It's the night I was attacked, Serafina thought. She stepped slowly out onto the loggia, the long, beautiful outdoor room with its carved columns and sweeping archways, looking out onto the forest and the mountains and the radiance of the stars above. These aren't just my memories. It's like I'm here, living through it all again. This was her home, her place in the world. She was Biltmore's guardian, watching over the people she'd sworn to protect. She ran her eyes along the loggia's stone railing, looking for any sort of creature that might be hiding there. She checked the vaulted ceiling sweeping over her head, looking for shadows that didn't belong. And then she gazed out across the canopy of the forest, her eyes scanning for danger in the distance. But then she sensed a presence with her on the loggia. The hairs on the back of her neck rose up as a dark shape emerged from the shadows behind her. She heard a ticking sound followed by a long, raspy hiss. She turned just in time to see something coming toward her. She ducked and leapt aside, then shifted into panther form. Her lungs filled with air and her muscles bulged with power. Her claws sprang out. She roared into an attack, even as the hissing folds of the black cloak swept over her head and plunged her into darkness. She twisted her spine around and bit into the attacker's shoulders with her long fangs. Her panther heart hammered in her chest, driving her with dire strength. She clawed viciously at the attacker's side. She couldn't see his face, but she could feel him fighting to capture her in the cloak, pulling it over and around her. An ice-cold darkness soaked into her bones. That awful stench choked her. She fought through the dark, rippling void as the black cloak engulfed her. She could feel her sharp panther claws slashing through the fabric, shredding it, and the sounds of the ripping cloth filled her ears. She kept twisting and swiping and striking and swatting wildly with her paws, fighting for her life like she was drowning in cold black water. The slithering cloak wrapped itself around her, tightening like a coiling snake, even as it wrenched her soul away from her body and sucked her into its dark folds. She saw inside a cloak a black, swirling, horrible world, but then it all began to change. Her claws had slashed through the cloak's fabric. It could no longer hold what it had captured. The ruptured cloak hurled the inner reaches of its dark void out into the world and her soul with it. A boy came running on two strong legs out onto the loggia and charged toward the attacker. As the attacker turned, the hood fell away, and Serafina saw the face. The attacker wasn't Braden, and it wasn't Uriah. It was Rowena. Barking a vicious snarl, Gideon leapt upon Rowena, knocked her to the ground, and tore into her neck. Braden, fighting strong, grabbed her and tried to hold her down. Serafina had already wounded Rowena, but she was still far too strong. The sorceress threw wicked spells, one barrage after another, that gashed Braden's face, tore at his legs, and threw him against a column. Gideon lunged for another attack, biting into Rowena's side. She struggled frantically and escaped the dog, then turned to flee. Braden clutched the shredded black cloak and pulled it from her just as she dropped over the railing's edge and disappeared into the dark of the night. Serafina lay wounded in human form on the stone floor, unable to move. Rowena's spells had torn her chest and stomach with gaping wounds. When she tried to take in a breath, a lightning bolt of pain shot through her ribs. She tried to move her bloody arms and legs, but they lay uselessly around her. All she could do was watch the dark pool of blood spread slowly across the floor. She knew she was going to die. The black fragments, the inner darkness of the black cloak that had been riven by her claws, floated all around her and began to drift with the wind. She tried to tilt her head to see if Braden had survived the battle, but her neck moved in a painfully jerking motion. When she finally managed to look over, she saw a terrifying sight. It wasn't Braden, but the body of a black panther, her, lying wounded on the floor beside her, the panther's flesh torn in the same way hers was, her sides bleeding and her bones shattered. Both she and the panther were moments from death. She knew it was the end. She tried to look for Braden, but she could not see him. "Braden," she gasped, blood gurgling up in her throat. Finally, he came into her view. Her heart leapt when she saw that he was still alive, but his head dripped with long, jagged cuts, and he dragged his leg behind him. She watched as he knelt beside the panther and put his hands on her sides, closing his eyes as he infused the cat with his healing power. He caressed the cat's head and spoke to her in words that Serafina couldn't hear, running his hands down the length of her long, furred body. When she was done with the panther, Braden moved quickly over to her. "Braden," she tried to say again, but her voice was so weak she knew he couldn't hear her. As he frantically examined her wound, she could see how badly she was hurt reflected in the grimace of his face. "I don't know what to do, Serafina," he said, as he ripped his shirt apart and tried to staunch the bleeding with it. He couldn't heal humans the way he could animals. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't want to go. Please say goodbye to my pa." But with a heavy grunt of pain, he gathered her up into his arms. "Hold on, Serafina," he told her, a fierce determination in his voice. She wrapped her arms around his neck and tried to hold on to him the best she could, but she could feel the strength waning, her consciousness drifting into a swirling black void. Braden carried her outside into the darkness, struggling on his bloodied leg, but unwilling to give up. "Stay with me, Serafina," he said as he carried her, and she clung to the sound of his voice. As blood dripped down onto her shoulder and neck, she didn't know whether it was his or hers. They were both shaking, bleeding, and terribly wounded, holding on to each other with their last hope. But Braden kept moving, carrying her through the darkness. He took her down into the gardens and set her on the ground beside the Master Rosarian's shed. Then he shouldered open the door, stormed in, and came out with supplies. Old wooden apple crates, a hammer and nails, and other tools. He quickly made a crude, stretcher-like box with shallow sides and dragged her body into it. Then he fastened the ends with a rope, called Gideon over, and the two of them began dragging her across the ground towards the trees. She drifted in and out of consciousness as Braden and the dog pulled her through the forest, Braden dragging his bloody leg behind him. When Braden finally reached the graveyard, he dragged her to the foot of the statue in the angel's glade and begged for the angel's help. "Take care of her," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You have to save her." As Braden pulled away from her, Serafina reached out with her last strength and grasped his arm. "Don't leave me here," she whispered hoarsely. "Don't leave me here." "I'm not going to leave you, Serafina," he told her. "I promise you, I will never leave you." As she lay dying with the blood seeping from her body, she looked up at the stars above her head and thought it was the last time she would ever see them. Her body was getting cold now. Her limbs were numb. The blood was receding. She could feel her life slipping away from her, her eyes closing for the last time. Then she heard the sound of digging. She saw the blurry image of Braden frantically digging a hole in the ground in the middle of the Angel's Glade. The last thing she saw was Braden dragging the crude coffin that contained her lifeless body into the bottom of the grave he had dug. His only hope was to bury her in the place of eternal spring. "Take care of her," Braden begged of the angel. "I will find a way to put her back together again." And then Serafina saw no more. The darkness that followed was so black and so long that she did not stir. Finally, a girl's voice came into the darkness. "You must return now." When Serafina opened her eyes, she found herself standing in the forest bog by Rowena's lair, just where she had been. A warm summer breeze drifted through the trees. The vision was over. Rowena was standing there alone. Her voice was filled with emotion when she said, "Now, you know what friendship is." Serafina, realizing that Rowena too had seen what Braden did on the night of the full moon, looked at her old enemy in amazement. "And so do you?" "And so do I," Rowena said.